Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, everyone, if you're still on the West Coast. So welcome to our last session of the morning. This is all PALs all the time. So if you didn't get enough PAL questions during the last session, we will give you another opportunity. Okay, Josh, if you'd advance one. So I just want to go through the general notes. You've complied with all of our rules. We're recording this, and please use the stage chat function to submit questions, and I'll try to get them out to people. Try to reserve some time for it. All right. So our first up is prize. It's another Sas panel. We do have Kevin substituting for Andy Clegg. Mark and Masood are continuing on. Kevin's a young guy in the bottom as compared to the old ugly guy, Andy, we just took off. So they're going to talk strictly about the PAL status. I think we covered a lot of that material because no one could wait for this session during the last one. But we'll pick up, I think there are a lot of unanswered questions. Then we're going to go on later and talk specifically about some of the issues with secondary markets. And then we're going to end up with a point counterpoint, really talking about the rationale for choosing to be GNA and the rationale for choosing to be PAL. So that's the program. Let's start up with the Sas panel now. You guys can see the questions in the side. And Masood's not on, okay? So that means, Mark, you and Kevin have the entire floor to yourselves.
Great. Hey, Kevin.
Hey, Mark. How are you?
How you doing?
Great.
So I'm kind of trying to remember what we haven't said about it. I've got some data that I pulled out of our system, which is interesting. Actually, it's not that different than what I said before. One thing to point, and Kevin, you'll have this too, is that, I think I said in the last session, there's about 4,100 PPAs that have been claimed so far, and a total of about 17,600 channels that have been claimed in SASs from all licensees who claim channels. And what's interesting is if you look at it across all of them, there's an overwhelming bias towards channel 1 by almost a factor of 2 to 1, which is mostly Dish. If you factor Dish out of that, it substantially weights the other way. And so, in fact, if you factor Dish out of everything, it's the bias then is more toward things above channel 4 or channel 5 and above. Substantially. So interestingly enough, Dish is going after more, and this is all again that's been public in the data, going after the lower channels. So take that for what it's worth. It's just an interesting tidbit that the data are telling us. Other than that, I'll let Kevin speak. You anything to add?
No, I think I'm most excited to see how the secondary market develops for PAL channels. Yeah. As we're just seeing more and more deployments, we're seeing certain areas that are becoming kind of impacted for spectrum. And I think that the ability to actually kind of go and reserve your own piece of spectrum is going to be more and more important. So I'm excited to see how that plays out.
Yeah, we're thinking the secondary is sort of pent up. That a lot of people are waiting for the PALs to come together and for licenses to be awarded and for people to figure out what role the SAS has had in all of that. And now that that's sort of happening, and also the commission is still awarding licenses. There are only a few. Yep. They awarded some just a couple of weeks ago. Probably some of the more complex ones. I think, as Dave said, or I've heard it before. I think Dave said it. This was the probably the most complex auction. The commission's, well, maybe not most complex considering the incentive auction, but certainly one of the most complex when you consider the number of licenses that were awarded. And the total number of participants. There were 500 or 250 some people that participated, and 220 to 30 that won spectrum in the auction, which is more than any other auction that have happened. So trying to sort through the long forms for 230 some licensees is complex. And so some of the more complex ones, they're just going through. In fact, one of the ones they just did was one, there were a lot of ownership changes. There's still a few more left to do, and so that'll figure into things. But those are some of the things that are sort of happening in the background. But I agree with Kevin. Masood, we just kind of got started. I gave some stats on what's going on. Kevin mentioned that he thought that the secondary market is pent up. I agreed. That's where we are. So you didn't really miss much.
Yeah. Thank you. If the discussion is on the PAL, just yesterday, it was over the weekend. that a new database, PAL database, was kind of deployed on the WinForum location that we normally make the PAL database available. The new added 21 licenses were added. So majority of the licenses have been provided by FCC. So as Mark said, some are remained. And we have identified the PAL channel for all of them. We are going to discuss among SAS admins for potential maybe another swapping opportunity. We haven't decided yet. And for secondary market, as Mark said, we are getting very close to make it happen. As a matter of fact, we finished some trial and testing with FCC on the API for Light Touch 2 weeks ago, and as we speak, FCC has opened the window for the final test to make us kind of authorized to use the Light Touch process. So my guess is that very soon, in a couple of weeks or a month or whatever, the Light Touch process would be on, and we can start the process of PAL leasing. So, and SAS, by the way, SASs in terms of the protection and using that, SASs are also ready. It's only waiting for the framework that FCC has been working on using the Light Touch process.
So we're going to do some lightning rounds here, real quick, each of you. What has surprised you favorably in the PAL write-up? We'll start with Mark.
The total number of people that showed up initially and got started. We SAS admins put a lot of effort into outreach, and so surprised me favorably that worked. So I'd say that.
Okay, Kevin, I gave you a little bit of chance to think about it. What surprised you favorably?
I think for me, it was how quickly it got up and running. When I think about how CVRS got started, it was like very much a crawl. Like, are we live? Are we live?
Late, Kevin. You should have been here 8 years ago.
I know. I can imagine, right? PALs, they got delayed once or twice, but once they were live, boom, they were live. People were declaring PPAs, and it was ready, set, go. So I was impressed at how quickly that got up and running and how seamless it was for our customers.
Okay, Masood, lightning round, real quick.
Same thing. As a matter of fact, when we developed the portal for the licenses to get in and provide their desired channel, we were worried because there are about 240 licenses. Many of them are small. But I can tell you that out of 238, I guess, initial 238, about 225 got in, and they provided their desired channel. So we had a lot of interaction with them, but it really surprised me. It was a very good turnout, and we were able to provide the PAL channels fairly. As a matter of fact, when we finished it with the PAL deployment, the number of concerns and complaints, we had only maybe one or two that very quickly we resolved it. So it was, as Kevin said, the process for PAL channel assignment was very smooth, and also the deployment process was very smooth because SAS admins have been able to do interoperability testing beforehand on time. So everything went very smooth. So.
Lightning rounds, Masood, lightning rounds. Okay, Kevin, starting with you. The opposite question. What really surprised you that didn't work, that becomes part of the job jar, you think?
Okay, so I'm going to say what surprised me. I don't want to say it didn't work, but I think when we're talking about the secondary market, we just completed a survey of some of our largest customers, asking them like how they felt about secondary markets, what kind of transactions they were looking to. I think the biggest thing that surprised me was how different they all were. I would have figured that like the top 5, 10 PAL owners would all sort of be the same, but some wanted SAS, some wanted the SAS to execute to help, do secondary market transactions. Some specifically said we don't want the SAS involved. We want to be able to negotiate these as one-offs directly with customers. And so it feels to me like the secondary market is a little bit of a new wild, wild west. And I'm just surprised at how different the desires and wishes are of customers that I would have thought would have all had very similar things to say.
We're going to have 2 of them up in the next session. Okay, Masood, lightning round.
Yeah, I think one thing which is concerning is that how we are going to deal with the addition of PAL deployment. Of course, and we expect hopefully by the end of 2021 we are going to have much more PAL deployment in the country. One of the concern would be the use of the GA spectrum. So of course that shrinks the GA deployment space, and of course we need to make sure that SAS admins deploy enough coexistence mechanisms so that the GA spectrum is also efficient. That's definitely a concern that might be a problem for the plan. But Kevin, let me in terms of the PAL secondary market, I think it is important that those customers that hear this panel, SAS admins are not necessarily by defining the role by FCC are not necessarily tasked to do the negotiation between the customer, the lessee and lessor. Lessee and lessor, as before, they can talk to each other, they can negotiate. Of course, there might be some facilitators, but the job of the SAS admins are to register the SAS, the leasing transaction with FCC and facilitate to do that much faster. I was talking yesterday that the conventional Form 608 would have been taken several weeks, 5-6 weeks. Now it can be done within minutes. So with this light touch process, it can be done within minutes with a very high granularity, spatial and frequency and time granularity. So that is the role of the SAS. Of course, this framework does not prevent...
Lightning round. It's a good question, but it's a separate one. I'm going to interrupt you. Mark.
Okay,
you're disciplined on these lightning rounds.
Just remind me the question. The question was, what surprised me that didn't work? Was that? Yeah.
Or it didn't work. What was a negative surprise?
I think it was a negative surprise, and I think we're working on it. Is some of the nuances of location versus whether it can be PAL. So, for example, a lot of it has to do with where the CBSD is located. Versus what it's covering, and we're going to have to go back. Right now, the way it works is if a CBSD is in one county that's not, and it's not at PAL, then it can't necessarily be used to light up another county. So we've got to go back and fix that. And that surprised me. That's how it works. So, but we'll fix that. Minor issue, but that's one thing that surprised me.
So in my other unremunerated hobby job of chairing the CBR Wind Forum steering group, it's gotten as confrontational and as emotional as we were during COEX over issues. I think we all thought that PALs were done. This was one and done. We're off and going, and yet we're seeing incredible controversy over some of the issues coming up in Wind Forum about how PALs actually operate. So this is not the place to take positions on those, but I'd like for perceptions from all three of you guys on what are the unsolved problems in PALs that either we've discovered or we just brushed over the first time.
I think one of them is just, what happens to a PAL in case of a DPA activation, right? This is like the big one, I think. Is a channel reserved for that PAL holder on a different channel? And then what happens if someone's already operating there? Do they get bumped? What happens if it's a wideband activation and 4 channels get taken offline, and then there's just not enough remaining PAL channels to assign to all the PAL holders, even if you decide to reserve those? So I think that is something that is a little bit controversial, and everyone's very opinionated on and needs to get figured out.
So there's enough issues here for one for each of you guys. Masood, next.
I think the same. I think that's the most important. I think there are a couple of tiny issues as Mark said, but the most important one is the one that Kevin raised.
Yeah, I'd go with that. I'd say that's the main problem we have. It's a little thorny because there are different opinions on it, but I think we'll work it out. We always have, and there hasn't been anybody hurt, so I think we'll figure it out.
Yeah, I thought like having to move everything in the county or just the radios affected one of you guys would throw out.
Well, I think the big question though is, and it's, I'll say it is that why did the commission reserve 3 channels in the 10 channels available in any given market? What was the reason for that? And are those channels supposed to be so that there's some PAL assurance? On the other hand, suppose those channels are occupied by GAA. Is it fair to kick a GAA guy off for a PAL guy And then the PAL guys are arguing, well, I spent money on my license, so I should have some GAA or some PAL assurance. And the trouble is the SASs are in the middle of this, and it kind of becomes incumbent upon us to work it out, within the various bodies and frameworks with a great leadership by the people that are doing that. So,
I think it's all the great leadership of the chair, but that's okay.
It surely is to sit back and let us, gnash at it.
Yeah, so I just want to reiterate that that's not a simple problem. I think from both sides, in terms of the impact and the solution, I think it is not a simple problem, but we also understand the right of the PAL licenses. So we need to work on that. So it's not a simple problem.
One point of this conversation might be to our membership that it's still important that they stay involved in these decisions, because we're both learning and we're also having to burrow deeper into these issues than we were the first time around. Okay, so we've seen PAL movement in. All of your SASs are picking up PALs. Do you see that this was a big rush of people who were already deployed, or are we seeing people who waited for PALs? What's the momentum for PALs look like? And we'll start this time with Mark. Lightning again.
Yeah, the momentum is, that's one surprise I have. I thought there'd be a bigger pent-up demand, and that the momentum out of the chute would be sort of a big spike, like a delta function, and then we'd start flattening out, and that's not really what's happening. It sort of went up, and it's kind of staying up. So the question is, I know this is a lightning round, but the question is, was there enough pent-up demand from people that had deployed GA, they're converting to PAL, and I'm not seeing a lot of that. So I'm kind of surprised that we're not having a lot more people going in for PALs and PPA protections. That's surprising me.
So I'm going to go around with Masood and Kevin, but I would point out to those who may not be into Sal subtleties, this is a unique marketplace that Mark can see all of Masood's and Google's customers. Kevin can see all of Mark's and Masood's. So it's a unique place where every one of us can speak to the market universally with absolute knowledge. Okay, Masood, thanks to you.
Yeah, so that we have about 21,000, close to 21,000 PAL licenses in the country, about 3,000 something counties and about 21,000 licenses. So the biggest license PAL holders are, in terms of the number of licenses, are Verizon, Dish, Charter, Comcast. Of course, we have Windstream and Mediacom, and Nextlink also, that the large number, and ATN, large number. But some of those large PAL license holders have not yet started their full CBRS deployment. And for example, Dish Network, which by far has the highest number of PAL licenses, about 1/4 of all PAL licenses belong to Dish. They have not yet started. So yes, I think that's true that we haven't seen a huge rush. Some of the maybe the fixed wireless network, we have seen migration to PAL, but the big rush would come when those large PAL holders start to deploying in general CBRS and in particular PAL.
Kevin, anything?
Yeah, I would say that hindsight is always 20/20, and there have been these moments in CBRS where all the PAL administrators are sort of trying to predict what's going to happen at this specific moment in time. And then when you look back on it, it was like sort of obvious. I think that me personally, I thought that as soon as PALs went live, there was going to be like this new rush of deployment. And I think when I look back on it, it's that people made decisions of what to do with CBRS based on how many PALs they had. But at that point, then their deployment timelines were their deployment timelines, many times impacted more by hardware availability, or, when they, when their teams were ready to hang radios and things like that. And that it wasn't like they were waiting for PALs to go live. They're going to deploy when they're going to deploy. And then as they deploy, they'll turn those PALs on. So I feel like there was no inflection point of all of a sudden PALs, now people are deploying, but they are a critical piece to the people who have not yet deployed, to Masood's point.
Okay, so I think one of the expectations is that interest in secondary markets would arise as people got kind of unhappy with GA. Why would you pay for something you're getting for free? And so that the GAA interference and lack of coexistence would essentially drive people to show interest in secondary markets. Have we started to see the benefits of PAL in terms of significant congestion in GAA areas? Or are we still at the point where PALs and GAA operate with essentially similar interference environments? And I'll start with you, Masood.
Yeah, as you mentioned, because still we haven't seen a huge rush on the PAL deployment, we haven't necessarily seen a big bump on the amount of interference complaints. But we expect that would happen, given the fact that almost 50% of the whole band would go for the PAL, and the GA users, the area would be shrunk, and especially when it is close to the coastal areas. So we would definitely expect that what you just Preston mentioned to come, and that requires and makes the necessity of an efficient coexistence algorithm more critical. So we are working on that, and we are hoping that soon we can do that both in the individual SASs as well as among SAS admins.
Kevin, are we seeing GAA conflicts that would drive people, or is GAA still sparse enough that why spend for something that's free?
I have a slightly different take on this, and that again, early on, there's a sort of interesting thing with PALs, right? Where if you don't deploy, you can't declare a PPA, right? So, that's all this GAA spectrum. It's gonna be great for users out there, but all it takes is a handful of users to, use all that spectrum themselves. And so we are seeing some areas where, like, every week we're on some calls where there are some areas, and it's not necessarily like the ones you expect. It's not necessarily like the most metropolitan, densely packed parts of the United States, but there's some areas where there are really just a lot of GAA users, and they're having difficulty getting clean spectrum. And so I think that I personally think that the secondary markets are going to be really key for private LTE deployments, right? Where there's going to be places where maybe it's a college campus, maybe it's an office building, where they don't need a lot of spectrum, but they just want it to be clean. And then those are places where some of those PAL holders actually have no intent to deploy. And then there's just hopefully it can just be a very easy transaction between those parties. But we're definitely seeing places in the country now where GAA is not enough. And we know that that problem is only going to be amplified as some of the larger deployers really get going in the next year or two.
As an advocate of CBRS, I've always felt like I would feel warm when there were a lot of GAA complaints, because we were successful. It may not be good for the radios, but at least it would be good for my self-worth.
Yeah, there you go. I completely agree with you, right? It would be a completely different problem if it was like everything was wide open and everybody could get 150 megahertz and there were no PAL deployers. Yeah.
And we're seeing the same thing.
So as we coming to the end of the session, what haven't we talked about that the membership needs to understand about the PAL rollout? If everyone can, this is not short format. So what else haven't in these two sessions we talked about in PALs that you think's really important to convey? SASs have a unique insight into this industry. So Mark, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd say the one thing that sort of is behind the curtain that people aren't really fully aware of is the impact of the DPA activations on PAL, and so we're trying to, and the Alliance is putting a lot of time and effort and money into trying to deal with some of these issues. There we have had issues where some of our customers are encountering some weirdness in deployments. I won't say where, but weirdness in deployments. And so, and these are PAL people. So we are trying to fine tune that whole, incumbent informing ESC type thing to address those issues. They're not huge, but to the extent that they affect somebody, they're big for them. So we're trying to deal with some of that.
Okay, Masood.
That's one issue. And to resolve that issue, I think one of the work that we are doing, as we mentioned in the SAS rollout session before, is to work with DoD to try to at least reduce or minimize the impact of DPA activation to the whole ecosystem. I think that's very important to mitigate that fact. But the good thing about the PAL, the development that we have done in WinForum and OnGo Alliance is that as far as the operators are concerned, potentially the PAL deployment could be transparent. In other words, they don't have to, accept the fact that they just claim that they want to deploy the PAL. Other than that, it's from a CBSD registration and deployment perspective, it is kind of transparent to them, and the specification has made it very simple for them to do the migration. But those difficulties that Mark talked about, definitely we are working with that, and we will be transparent, and the ecosystem would know the solution as soon as they are done.
All right. Well, Kevin, you have the last word.
Yeah, I think it's two things. It's one, everyone, for everyone who bought PALs, it seemed like everyone had a slightly different perspective on what happens when a DPA activation happens. And so we need to get that figured out. And then the other thing too is just for GAA deployers who have already deployed in areas that they thought would be low for interference, and they're seeing that they can't really get clean channels. We're seeing a pent-up demand for, okay, all right, so I do want to buy some spectrum. Like, how do I do it? Who do I talk to? How do I get that deal done? So I think that part is still not clear and needs to emerge soon.
Kevin, you talk about relocation much more. We're going to make you have to come to these wind forum calls. All right. Well, I thank the panelists. If this was an presence meeting, we would give you a little gift as you came off the stage. Well, we can't do that virtually, but we will in St. Louis in 3 months. So everyone be ready, because we'll be giving out trinkets in 3 months, and you want to be one who gets them. All right. So Josh,
thank everybody.
Take them down, and let's go to back to the PowerPoint. So if you haven't had enough PAL, let's talk specifically now about secondary markets. And we have Max from Verizon and Andreas and Carlos, I'm sorry for pronouncing names, walking through this. Guys, I need you to keep it to about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I know, Max, you got a lot of calls. For those but just to cast this a bit, I think there was an image that like PALs were a one and done with the auction. And I think what we want to do is make the membership understand the amount of dynamicism that will ultimately come out in these secondary markets. I spoke to one PAL holder yesterday who holds a large number of PALs in a major metropolitan area. And he's only going to use 2% of the area. So 98% of that PAL is going to come open, and it's not Verizon. 98% of that PAL is going to come open for secondary markets. So very likely the secondary markets are going to see something that's not terribly different in extent than what we saw in the original auction. So this is not a closed option. This is a continuing and ongoing option, whether you're in GAA or PAL. For PAL, maybe it's better to sell it. If you're in GAA, maybe it's better to rent it. But please don't think of this as just, for the people who bought PALs. This is, I think, more important for those of you who didn't buy PALs, but might want to solve some of the problems that Kevin just mentioned. With that, Max, take it away, and I won't charge you for my minute.
Okay, thank you, Preston. Yeah, so let's jump right into the second slide there and discuss, what's the whole point of PAL leasing and the use of the PAL licenses. So we all know that spectrum is a precious resource, especially in condensed areas, especially in urban areas, maybe other points of use, airports, things like that. And the need for the users is for a high quality network grade access on the radio to put your own mission critical applications for, data, whatever you're doing, whether you're a private LTE customer, a hospital, different kinds of businesses. And the idea is that they would have a high quality network that was better than a Wi-Fi grade unlicensed, or even the GAA grade unlicensed, say perhaps using the LTE air interface. And so that's kind of the notion, is that these providers of private networks, maybe it's a hotel or a motel, they want this access, and they're willing to pay for it to get interference-free performance that's better than what they could get with the GAA use. And that's the whole point of the CBRS band sharing. We have these tier 2 PAL licenses in this lower 100 megahertz, the 3550 to 3650 portion, and we have up to 7 of those 10 megahertz TDD channels could be licensed to, let's call them the landlords, right, who own that spectrum. And so the landlord, or if he leases to a tenant, these are the folks who can claim PAL protection areas for protected use of those channels so they won't be interfered with by other PAL or other GA users over the core, the area of their CBSD cluster. So the notion is that we could micro lease areas of a county either in time temporarily or in space to cover these CBSD clusters of the private user. And then we know that the unused portion of the PAL where the PPA doesn't exist, that reverts to GAA. But just like Preston said, if a landlord owns a whole county and is only using 2% of it, then theoretically the other 98% is also available for leasing if that owner wants to be a landlord and wants to accept tenants. And so at a high level, what WinForum has identified is the need for some kind of platform for what I will call micro leasing. The idea of something like an eBay or website-based thing that allows landlords and tenants and brokers who may be represented by various SaaS vendors to get together and be able to have standardized databases and interfaces so that people can build tools so that the potential tenants can look on the website and say, oh, I want to rent some PAL Spectrum rights, in this area, next year for an event that I'm running or something like that. And that it's easy for them to access this and create the micro leasing. So when we talk about the FCC light touch leasing paradigm, in a sense, that's the back end. And I'll show that in the next couple of slides. That's where the lease is already consummated and it's filed with the FCC's ULS database. And I'll show that, in a block diagram. What's missing is the front end of the leasing. How do we create web-based standard micro leasing tools like an auction website or a listing website? How do we create standardized data elements? And that would include, how does the landlord make an offer? How does a potential tenant make a bid? How does the broker accept the bid and, file with the landlord? How does the leasing mechanism happen before the lease is consummated and before it's filed with the FCC? Because the light touch paradigm that the FCC put together is really only about substituting a physical Form 608 with an electronic form where the transaction is recorded electronically by the SaaS into the FCC's ULS database. And I'll show that in the next picture. So the point is we sell them by county and we can disaggregate them. Most of the private LTE users are not going to need a whole county of allocation. And the spatial and temporal rights that PAL owners have, the landlords, they're a natural fit for disaggregation and leasing and what I would call the micro leasing. So let's go to the next slide. So there's two areas, two documents that the WinForum has been working on. Neither have been fully vetted and neither have been fully balloted. One, the 5004 document, was more details on how the information was suggested for the FCC ULS database. And it seems that the FCC is reluctant to make any changes. And so many of those changes will have to go into a new WinForum database to be captured in a separate place since we want to preserve the way the FCC ULS database is at the moment. And then the second document was the 5007 document. And that was the overarching framework that includes more than just what goes in the FCC ULS database, but captures the precursor elements of how someone would make, an offer or a bid and what data elements are needed. And so I'm going to move a little more quickly through this and just jump right to the pictures. So let's go to the next slide. And let's go to the next slide because it's a little better. So here's the paradigm that the WinForum is working to. And the green arrow all the way over on the right, that's the API application that the FCC has put in place for the light touch leasing. That's where the managing SaaS knows about the consummated lease and files the area and the duration and the details of the landlord and the tenant into the FCC's PAL sales and leasing database in ULS. So that's once the lease is consummated, we can do that. And at that point, then all the other SaaSes can access that information and understand that the area that's being leased is now owned by the tenant, and the tenant may make PPA claims there. What's missing from the WinForum perspective is all the way over on the left, the red arrow to the top block there. How do the users get information from their SaaS and file with a market maker the the landlord's offering and the tenant's bid and all that stuff, so that the leases can be brokered online for the microtransactions. And that's kind of the gist of what WinForum wants to concentrate. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I'm just going to, highlight it. So let's go to the next slide. So there's a lot of information that the WinForum is proposing as the information set, and some of it is already captured by the FCC. But the new items marked in red, there are some items that the FCC didn't really talk about, and we think that we would like to capture them and file them in a database that the WinForum runs. And if we go back one slide, I'll show that again. I'm sorry. So all the way over on the right is the PAL ULS database run by the FCC, and then highlighted in the yellow is the database that the WinForum would create to store these additional records for each transaction to allow the SASs to access this information. So that's the gist of it. Let's go down to the next couple of slides. Let me see if there's anything else. Let's go down one more slide. So these were some of the stuff that was not included in what the FCC wanted to replace 608 form with the light touch paradigm. And that's who created the record. We also propose in the WinForum that just like there could be light touch leasing, there could also be light touch sales. And these areas could be permanently transferred from the existing landlord to a new landlord with some kind of indication that instead of a lease, it was a sale. That could also be accomplished, if the FCC, were to permit that. And then the idea is also to vet transactions by having a precursor area, the area that the landlord starts with, before he breaks it up into what he's retaining and what he's leasing. And then another new concept is after a landlord does that, not only does he file the area that's transferred to the tenant, but he also files a record for what he's retaining. And that makes it easier for the SAS to understand what piece of the property is in which hands, rather than using recursion to subtract out all the leases from the existing county. So that's kind of what's going on. The next couple of slides, go through some more additional information. I'm not going to go through them in detail. But that was the intent of the WinForum, was to build standardized data elements, standardized interfaces to allow the various participants, the landlords, the tenants, and the brokers, to be able to trade this information on tools that were built by third parties, and then consummate these leases, and then hand them back over to the managing SAS, who would file them with a light touch leasing paradigm with the FCC once the lease was consummated. So I'll stop there. So, okay, we had a question there. How long after the auction does the PAL convert back to GA? Okay, so a PAL never converts back and forward between GA. What it is the PAL county rights that a landlord owns. The landlord does not own the exclusive use of the spectrum ever, right? So what happens is, for the landlord to make use of the PAL rights that he has to deploy CBSDs over an area, and then this number of radios becomes a CBSD cluster, and that cluster area that's covered becomes a PAL protection area claim. So he goes back to his managing SAS and he says, look, I have a dozen of these radios, installed in this shopping mall, and here's the boundary of the shopping mall and the parking lot, and I would like to claim a PPA that covers this area. The SAS vets the claim and then issues that claim, and that PPA area then becomes filed with all the other SASs, so that they know that, say, Verizon is covering this shopping mall, and say Verizon has channel 4, then all the other SASs know they can't issue channel 4 within, say, 1,000 yards of that PPA boundary. The rest of the county is still available for other GAAs to use, if they're far enough away that they won't interfere with the claimed PPA or PPAs.
Thanks, Max. So I'd like to bring up Andreas. Josh, if we can slip to his slides, thank you. So Andreas is going to talk about this, and I apologize for clobbering your last name.
No worries at all. It's a tough one.
Go for it.
You have to sound it out. Thank you, Preston. Thank you, OnGo, for having me. Definitely excited, and thanks to all the panelists. A lot of really good information here. We can jump right into the first slide. I promise I'm not going to make this a commercial, but I think it's important in terms of setting the foundation to what we're going to talk about. So who Select Spectrum? Select Spectrum is essentially a licensed spectrum brokerage firm facilitating transactions for licensed spectrum, as you may imagine, currently representing licensees across about 22 bands ranging from 150 megahertz up to 40 gigahertz. In a little under a decade, I'd say that we transacted about over 300 licenses amounting into over $500 million in proceeds for our clients. The majority of our success has been in the mid-band. When I say mid-band, the majority of our success has been in the 2.5 gigahertz band, working that band. That's obviously, the majority controlled by T-Mobile, if you will. Also have had a lot of success completing several dozen transactions in the predecessor to CBRS, as you all may remember, the NN band, which is basically a national site-based license and very different to what it is today. Aside from that, I should say that we also did the principles of Select Spectrum. We did participate in the CBRS auction under a consortium structure, which basically consisted of 4 groups, some operators, and also an acquisition vehicle. And we were successful in obtaining PALs in over 35 counties across the country. And we can go to the next slide, please. All right, so I think this is what everyone is interested in, and this has been touched on by some of the other folks on this call, is basically, what's the current transactional environment for PALs? Where is the demand and where is the supply at? So in terms of demand, and this has been hit a few times during this call, I mean, you have current PAL holders, operators to some extent, organizations with private LTE networks that are looking to increase their capacity. They're looking to load on some more applications and use cases. Therefore, they want to turn their 10 into 20 or 20 into 30, so on and so forth. As Preston put it, I think earlier, I mean, you do have some operators that are in GAA today, and getting either a little frustrated with GAA in terms of some of the interference that they've been experiencing, or just want to add a layer of reliability and sustainability by obtaining a PAL. I think everyone understands that, in some areas, GAA is really congested today. It's probably only going to continue to get more congested. Therefore, the sooner you can get your hands on a PAL, the better. And I think that's what we're hearing from the market in terms of your smaller and mid-size operators that are out there deploying in CBRS. It goes without saying that there's a very scarce amount of broadband spectrum out there that's available, right? What do we have? We have 2.5 gigahertz, which there's probably under 50 2.5 gigahertz licenses that are available out there in the marketplace that aren't being leased or haven't already been purchased. I mean, you have the C band, which was just auctioned, a carrier dominant auction. You have 3, 4, 5 coming down the pipe. I mean, what other mid band do operators have access to? In smaller sizes, if you will, closer to the census tract that many have advocated for. On the supply side, I mean, I think there are a few different types of organization, if you will, that are very interested in seeing the secondary market play out here. I mean, one of those are the spectrum investors, and naturally they bid in these auctions, and they're looking for a return on investment. They're looking to monetize the assets that they've purchased, I think, sooner than later. And I don't think until as of late, I don't think they've known that they can transact, right? Everyone is waiting for things to fall in place with regard to the SAS and the FCC, and they're kind of just waiting. And as it's been put earlier in this presentation, I think the demand, the interest on the supply side is also pent up. Like, hey, we're ready to start leasing these assets. What do we have to do? How do we do that? How do we get there? And that's something that we're playing a large part in. Another type of organization that I think we're going to see is going to become really frequent is your operator that may be operating on some of their PALs or a portion of some of their PALs. And they're saying, hey, well, we don't have any plans to operate in the balance of this county. What if we can monetize the balance and generate some revenue streams and some return on our investment in some of these areas that we're not interested in operating in? Now, that gets a little sticky, right? So if you just think a hypothetical situation, you have let's just say a WISP. They're likely not going to want to lease the balance of their PAL to another WISP. They're going to want to lease or sell it to a non-competing entity. And I think that's another, some more value that Select Spectrum brings. We can go to the next slide, please. So that brings me into CBRS Direct. And Max, I think you gave a really good intro to this during your presentation. And I think what you were alluding to is exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about an innovative web-based secondary marketplace, which essentially facilitates transactions for PAL spectrum rights in the CBRS band. I'm not going to say neutral host here because that's going to get confused, but it's a neutral platform that in an exchange that allows buyers, sellers, lessees, lessors, other brokers, managers, whoever you are, to utilize this platform and facilitate transactions for PAL spectrum rights efficiently and effectively. And I think, just to put a finer point on that, Max was mentioning, the preceding framework, right? How before it gets to light touch or before it gets to the FCC, how does all that work? That's exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about, very intuitive user end tools in terms of negotiation, making offers, important information as it relates to being able to perform diligence on the assets, right? So for example, how much capacity is available in this given county? How about the adjacent counties? Who may be there now? And then obviously, being able to put those pieces together in terms of geographically. So we can go to the next slide, please. So again, we're looking to streamline the transaction. I mean, we've been boots on the ground. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we've done deals amounting into over $500 million for our clients. So we're trying to take everything that we believe is required to facilitate these transactions and inject them in a web platform and allow people to utilize it and streamline the transactions, for lack of better terms. Some really important functionality that I believe the platform that people would be interested in is the ability to perform geographic partitions. So I mentioned on the last slide, say for example, in a different example, you have a county that's available for lease and you have an operator that's only interested, they only serve customers in the northwest portion of that county. It doesn't make the most sense for them to lease or purchase the whole county. With our platform, they're going to be able to upload a shapefile, KMZ, whatever it may be, probably less efficient to draw the polygon on our platform, but basically determine how many pops are encompassed by this shape where we serve our customers, and then basically be able to dictate a value from that. Because I think one of the issues that we're experiencing out in the market is, operators are very good at deploying networks, but they don't have a ton of experience in transacting spectrum. They don't know exactly where to start. What do I offer? What does it look like? In what form? So our platform is going to help aggregate all that information in a form that, licensees are used to receiving offers in. So some of that, lease duration, escalators, how do you get to a value? At an elementary level, what is megahertz pop? How do you get to that megahertz pop number? So on and so forth. So that's all, I think, really, really important. And again, really, it's essentially checking the boxes of the economic and contractual terms that are required to have a meeting of the minds on before you go to the FCC and before you go file anything. Again, we think a very important resource in terms of people just being able to get into the platform and be able to determine what's available on the market, right? To start there. And, they'd be able to do that with no cost to their organization. They'd be able to do that. Our system would work essentially on a success fee. If a transaction occurs, then we would get paid a very small success fee. The platform would be paid. But other than that, organizations and individuals can utilize the platform free of charge. We can go to the next slide. So this is really important, and I think I'm short on time, so I'm going to spend the most time on this. So again, a lot of, I think, sellers and buyers and lessees and lessors are saying, hey, we want access to PAL spectrum, or we want to monetize our PAL spectrum, but where do we start? Can we even do that yet? And our opinion is that sellers can sell and buyers can buy. We would have to do the old school approach, what Select Spectrum is used to doing for many years, going to the FCC, filing the application. It's a longer and more tedious process. It's not the ideal process, but until the necessary components fall into place and light touch leasing, we're ready to rock, we don't see ourselves having another choice. And we see this a way to address that pent-up demand that has built up in the market and that we have experienced. So in terms of a sale, I think it's as simple as an assignment of authorization. In terms of a lease, I think you can either go long-term de facto or spectrum manager. And I don't want to cannibalize the call and go into what each one of those are. But the major difference is the amount of control that the licensee retains, and how much control they want to retain would be, dictate which way you were to go. One thing I think it's safe to announce, we think, please someone tell us if we're wrong, but we have just signed contracts for what we believe to be the first lease deal for PAL Spectrum in the CBRS band. Was happy, the timing was good. It actually all got signed last night. And next it will be going to filing at the FCC. So everyone can watch out for that and kind of follow how it plays out. But our interpretation, I guess, and our opinion of how it could work at this given point in time is, the SAS needs FCC authorization via Part 96. If we can get consent or a grant to that lease, then there's that authorization. Maybe we have to manually go to the SAS and say, hey, here it is, the lease has posted. How can you interpret that? Can the SAS systems do that automatically and be notified that that lease is in place? We're going to find out, and hopefully we can come back and then update you on how that goes. We can go to the next slide if I have time. I don't believe I have time.
No, I think we're going to have to move on. And I think that was a little bit bordering on an ad, but that's okay. It's an interesting ad. If we could bring Max on too. Thank you. So one question to both of you is how dynamic. So I think about when we started PCAST and Verizon was so opposed to us. Eric Schmidt was our co-chair. He parachuted into one of our meetings and said, what I want this to be is AdWords for Spectrum. Dynamic, any parameter people want, very short. So how dynamic do you see the secondary markets? Are they perpetual? Are they with rights of renewal? I talked to one very large PAL holder yesterday, and he's thinking like, I can rent it during the day for some things and rent it at night to someone else. Other people have talked about sub-channel for paging or things. So I'd like both of you to comment on the degree of dynamicism you see in the secondaries, or are they going to look more like the way we've traditionally done Spectrum? Let's start with you, Andreas.
Yeah, sure. So I think time will tell how dynamic we can get. And depending on the functionality of the SAS systems like ours and what others are doing in the market, I think it makes perfect sense. The example that you use, Preston, somebody's using it at night. Maybe a school is using it from 3 to 6 p.m. For their after-school program, and then at night it goes to someone else. Hopefully we can get there. I mean, right now we're really focused on just being able to transact, even at the most elementary stage.
Look out, look beyond. Don't worry about this year. Let's think, where are we in a couple of years?
Yeah, I mean, I think the microtransactions, really, we get into that, right? Being able to light something up for an event quickly, or a block party in the middle of Brooklyn, or whatever it may be. I think that's what we have to get to. And, the preceding work that goes into that and the logistics in terms of getting things registered with the FCC and the logistics to the SAS play a large part in that. How quickly and how efficiently can we do that? And the more efficient and quick we can do that, I think the quicker we get to what we're talking about.
So Max, you come from a very stable, long-term, things don't change company. How do you guys feel about dynamicism in this, particularly as a PAL holder?
Yeah, well, I can't really speak for Verizon. Verizon doesn't really have any plans at this point to be a lessor or a lessee, so I really don't want to speak for Verizon. But I think the notion of temporal rights based on events for people, like you said, a street fair or a school or some kind of event that a hotel is running at a conference, those are all use cases that make a lot of sense for why the temporal limits might be a certain, for a certain number of days or something like that. But then there's also the notion of machines. Maybe machines need access all the time. It's not quite clear to me what the applications are for the private LTE market, and what kind of applications they're trying to enable. The other one aspect that has come up that we haven't really resolved to is if a landlord, like your example, Preston, if you're only using 2% of your county PAL, you would not be eligible for renewability at the end of the 10-year PAL license term. You would lose your license because you didn't meet the build out. So the question is, if you leased out the other 98%, would that meet the FCC's criteria for maintaining your spectrum eligibility to renew your lease or your ownership as a landlord? And even if you did do that, like let's say it was Preston Associates and they used 4%, and then they leased out another 47%, so they were over 51 to some other entity. What if that 47% wasn't fully occupied by the tenant? What would happen to the landlord at the end of the 10 years? So those are some sticky questions, I think, that we haven't really fully explored, how that would work both mechanically and legally from the technical viability of the licenses. So I think there's still a lot of open questions, I think, in these areas.
I asked you to look out. You went out beyond 2. You went out to the 10-year renewal. That's certainly going out. The last question we're gonna ask is, when is your live site? I'm gonna put you have the last question, Andreas. We'll put that up as your closing remarks. So, how I would ask, has anyone approached Max? I don't know if you can answer it, but has anyone come and started the process to transact this stuff? I know, Andreas, you talked about one example, but are there people knocking on the doors now to rent? And then I'll ask the equivalent question: are there people knocking on the doors to sell? Andreas.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, we have one that we can speak of that you'll all see publicly, I think, in the next week. But there is a lot more in the negotiation stage as we speak. We're seeing a lot of demand and from a very diverse group of users, as you all can imagine. I mean, what the participation that we saw in the auction was just a very small bit of that. We saw different utilities, ag groups participating. Let's just use a utility, for example. Your typical utility doesn't have the expertise or is not prepared to participate in an FCC auction. So a lot of those sorts of groups are very interested in the spectrum, looking to see how they can get their hands on it. They're not the fastest moving groups. They perform a lot of diligence. It takes time, but there are other negotiations and other deals, occurring, like I said, as we speak.
So Max, you have been the big advocate for a very structured database for several years now. Got way beyond before COVID, which is sort of the way we measure time now. So what do you need to make this happen? What could the membership do to help you get this moving?
Yeah, so in my role, as co-chair for Working Group 5 for PALs and PPAs, the notion, as Andreas and I have been talking about, is this sort of micro leasing framework. Again, we put together those two documents, 5004, 5007, before the FCC fully finalized, what they wanted to do with the ULS database. So I do think we have to go back over that now and see, based on what the FCC has sort of etched in stone for ULS, what elements are there in the ULS and what elements are missing that we want to add. And then once we identify what those missing pieces are, I think we have to go back to the framework in 5004 and 5007 and, update those documents to reflect that, and then get consensus amongst the WinForm members and the SASs as to, how this framework makes sense, how the data elements would work, how the database would work that WinForm would host, and how all these pieces could fly back and forth between the brokers and the landlords and the tenants. And, and hopefully someone can put together a website as a working model and show that they can build a tool based on the databases and the interfaces that WinForm proposes. So that's the status where we are. I think we kind of have to do a reset now that that we know that the ULS is kind of frozen.
All right, Andreas, I'm going to give you one last quick sentence. When is the CBRS Direct website expected to go live?
Q4, beginning of Q1 2022. But this is still that one sentence. We love the platform. We're looking forward to the platform. We're doing everything we can now to connect licensees and Spectrum users. So we're not.
We'll give you credit. That was a semicolon. Thanks very much. Okay, Josh. Thank you, Max. Thanks to Andreas. It's exciting to hear. Let's bring up the last session in this group, continuing with our all pals all the time theme in this this session. So if we can bring up Ray and crew and Carlos. Great, thanks guys. So this session, our executive director got cute by calling it point counterpoint, but point counterpoint implies there's a right answer that we're going to pursue. And I think instead the opposite is true here. We're really looking to find out what was the rationale and why were two different approaches to CBRS spectrum right from the perspective of two of our members. What made them decide to invest in GA or invest in PAL? What made them decide that there were other places that were better to put their money? So we have two volunteers to participate in that. Ray Lepian from Agra Valley is going to represent, why did they buy a PAL? And Carlos Candera from Frontier is going to talk about why they chose not to make that investment in all of the markets they're in. And then we're going to sort of develop these ideas. I think, in the end, we want whether you bought a PAL or didn't, we want you to walk away satisfied with what you did in the audience. And we also want you to understand thinking you might be doing that might cause you to get engaged with that last session, which was the secondary market. And maybe that argument made sense. Maybe we should think about something very special. So with that, I'm going to ask Ray to sort of start and talk about why did you guys decide to spend all your hard-earned cash on buying a PAL? You helping? You have a thing about helping the Treasury? I mean, what drove you to this?
Well, Press, thank you. I think all of us have done enough to help the Treasury. So give you a little background on Niagara Valley Communications. We're located in the thumb of Michigan, headquartered in Pigeon, which is a town of 1,200 people. But we're the parent of 3 wholly owned subsidiaries, Pigeon Telephone, which is a legacy landline provider for over 100 years, Thumb Cellular, which is a cell phone provider, and then Niagara Valley Services, which that's where the PALs really come in. They provide fixed wireless broadband, fiber to the home, fiber to the business, DSL, and fiber transport. We've got roughly 45,000 customers. We're privately held. And we bought the PALs to provide additional spectrum for our fixed wireless broadband service. We're expecting to expand that. So if you want me to go into why we did it, that's fine. If you want a little more.
Why?
Sure. All right.
Why was that the best place to put your money?
Well,
in your opinion?
Well, like I said, we're planning to expand our fixed wireless broadband service into the rural areas of 36 additional counties in Michigan. We already own 600 megahertz spectrum in those counties, so we were looking for some additional spectrum that we could take the 600 megahertz and use that as an anchor for that spectrum. And the CBRS was a viable solution. It provided adequate capacity, and it was at what we thought was a reasonable price. One of the big things is we wanted to guarantee that we had specific spectrum for use all the time without any kind of interference or sharing. We're fortunate to have capital available to buy the PALs. We purchased between 2 and 4 PALs in each county. The purchase price for the PALs we felt was reasonable compared to other spectrum. If you look at the recent mid C-band spectrum, I mean, it's astronomical what some people are paying. So we feel we can still utilize GA if we need additional capacity. But we looked at it and said, this is a way to guarantee that we have use of what we really need to guarantee what we want for our customers during this expansion.
Okay. Now, the ground rule here is we have members who bought C-band spectrum. You can't make them feel bad. All right, Carlos, you guys, a big company, but you sat this one out. Talk to me about the rationale.
Well, it was a board decision. We look at the strategy of the deployments, and we are in 13 states. We invested. We have over 2,200 NOBs deployed, and the board. And on that time, the company situation. Right now, we're in a different situation. The strategy right now is Gigabit America. On that time last year, the board decided to step away from the PAL auction, use those funds for fiber, but also the strategy on the GAA based on CAF markets that we started deploying. Now that a year later that we have already deployed, that we have a customer base, now we're looking into the value that we were talking on the previous session, the secondary markets. We're looking at that point and present to the new board and the new vision what the value of the CBRS. Not only, I'm not going to talk as the band itself, but what the entire concept on the fixed wireless and the OnGo Alliance will bring multiple technologies together to try to bring the final outcome. But it was a board decision. It was hard for me to swallow, but it's
we wanted to have someone to come up and sort of say this was the right thing to do. And
it wasn't. I personally was like, do I have a future here? I have 250 employees. I run the entire architecture engineering team. I went straight to the top and I sat down, went to Connecticut, and I sat down with the board at that time, and then got the rationale. We discussed, we have a big copper plant, which now wireless is going to basically substitute the copper plants and continue the growth on this. And, we'll talk more, probably in 3 months when we see face to face our plans. And President, you and I are aligning some of the future things that we're working on other bands and basically putting it together. And let's see. But right now I'm GAA. I'm up for waiting for that secondary market to come. I'm anxious to see cost of what it's coming into, and also looking into, I'm suffering. I'm not, I'm suffering heavily. I got markets in Ohio, in Texas, in Arizona, Utah that it depends on the SaaS provider that you partner with, and it is what it is. You're at the bottom of the barrel, and but you got to survive with this war. But coexistence is important. I met with local operators. We talk, and the camaraderie that we come together when we talk and sit down is good. So just define boundaries sometimes. It's just shut down, lower power, and all that. Just trying to coexist together on markets. It's a shared spectrum. It's not like a free spectrum. It's just trying to put some commodity and some let's put some politics around it.
Have you, Carlos? Have you been impacted by lack of GAA coax? Have your services been hurt by interference?
I got several towers running just on 10 megahertz.
So there is a pain point here.
Yes.
So Ray, obviously you're not, because you've got PALs. But I was wondering, at the same time the GAA auction came out, 6 gigahertz was started. The rules for 6 gigahertz were becoming clear. 1.2 gigahertz, you don't have to pay anything. It's got a contention, but outdoors, presumably some, directionality versus high power. Did 6 gigahertz enter your thoughts at all as a free alternative?
No, it didn't at the time. I'll double back with Carlos. I mean, when we looked at this auction, it wasn't just, a sure thing. There was a lot of discussion about it, and there's a lot of merits to have the GAA, I think. I was going point counterpoint within our company on it. Should we do it or shouldn't we? Because I thought in a lot of areas that there's plenty of GAA available, and I didn't think there'd be that much demand that you'd need a PAL to get that specific spectrum and worry about interference. But I think there are places that you did, and our ownership. Their philosophy is they like to own things versus just use it. They like to guarantee the best they can for service, and so that's why we ended up going with the PAL.
So it's early. I think Ray's already got some experience on this. Roy, have you guys been able to see yet that, my gosh, where would we have been if we hadn't bought them? Has the GAA filled up around you more than you thought, perhaps?
Not yet, and quite interesting is that we haven't really been able to utilize our PALs yet. We've been running just on GAA because we're having some issues with the core and the vendor and getting it all to talk properly, and so there's some technical issues yet. We've been getting the deadline pushed back and back and back, but we've talked to people that are using the PAL spectrum that we have, and we're kind of put them on notice that once this goes up, we're going to be in there. So we're trying to be cooperative with people to move them before we just come in. But we're using GAA right now, and that's been very effective. And we haven't really run into any major interference that we haven't been able to resolve because, again, there's some adequate spectrum there that people can move right now.
You guys sort of had reverse experience. The one that didn't buy the PAL
yeah, really
would benefit from it, and the guy who did buy the PAL isn't really getting any benefit from it yet. So let's talk. We just had a session on secondary markets. It sounds like, Carlos, you're considering that to be more think about it as a more surgical entry into PALs than just buying up old counties. And so you can talk about that. Ray, on the flip side, are you guys thinking about monetizing spectrum you aren't going to use? So Carlos, why don't you take the first of that, and we'll ask both sides of this question.
Yeah, so we already identified 82 markets that we are going to look into. While we develop Y6 and develop the rest on the Y6, we have to triple the amount of towers that we deploy. But while we get there, and we just looking into secondary markets on these markets that we already defined, we already analyzed, we already got thumbs up, move on to them, and try to get at least 2 channels or more to trying to balance the network and the capacity, basically. So yeah, I'm anxious to that become available. I'm anxious to move forward, and also my architect team is working to future. Because, like I said, we rely on PAL, on GAA. We just have to look into what's the next thing that we can combine into this and move forward. And we're competing against heavy hitters on speeds on rural America. I got to beat this 150 megs on satellite, and the only way to beat it is do some combination on band aggregation and carrier aggregation, which is something we're going to work on.
Your last discussion must make our last 2 briefers very warm in their hearts. So, Roy, are you going to do the flip side? Are you thinking about monetizing unused spectrum?
Well, Press, when we got into it, we never even were thinking about that. I mean, we're going to see how much we can utilize, and I wouldn't say that it's out of the question. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't look at it. But there weren't any plans going into it. Another thing that is in might interest a number of people is, there's always rumors going around about what the FCC is going to do. And, there's been some rumors about maybe tweaking the power limitations on this too. And that would, I think, open some floodgates for some interest in people leasing the PALs too.
Yeah. We'll have one CBRS in the entire country. So, looking ahead, is there things that we in the Alliance, or for that matter in Wind Farm, we in the community, in our standards work and our process work, can be doing to help either one of you in either making better use of the PAL, or conversely in addressing not having enough PAL? What should be in the job jar as we meet for all these technical working groups and such over the next couple of days? Carlos, is there something?
Yeah, and I'm part of this coexisting groups. We just
my sympathies.
Yeah, so it's the coexistence is important. Working with Part 96 only approved devices in the field versus 3GPP devices, TDD timing, those are, I personally had experience in several areas, the effects of non fully TDD time solution versus a Pi 96. I think moving that forward and continue moving forward on the coexistence, because the band is there and it's good and it has reachability and a lot of benefits. And if you can carry aggregate of 40 megahertz, it's God bless you. And because the power is more, and then you can provide more speeds. But I think on the coexistence side, that continues to work and shaping, and if these other manufacturers, because they also will see the effects on us when somebody switches to different TD timing, and they're gonna see it. They're gonna see the harmonics being created over there. And the harmonics are large, and so I think the alliance is doing a good job. The people managing those forums, the chairmen of those forums, are doing a good job, and we just pitch in when we can, and I think we're going the right way on that right route. And while we go into this, I've been part of the alliance for many years now, and it's from years ago till now. It's a big day and night. It's a difference of what we're bringing to the table.
Coax has been quite a lift. Hopefully that's coming to some fruition here. So, Ray, what do we need to do to make using PALs more user-friendly, if you will?
I really don't know off the top of my head, Press, but one of the things, and one that a plug for the Alliance, and that we've been involved with it from the infancy too, and has seen it grow. And we joined to try to just get educated on CBRS, and the Alliance has been a great venue for us to do that. They've been beneficial in everything. They've been there whenever we've needed help, and it's provided us ways to develop relationships, meet people, and develop relationships, and that. But some of the things that we look at are it's hard being a small provider like ourselves compared to the Verizons and the AT&Ts and that, to get the equipment that we need. I mean, it would be great, and we're discussing it with one of our major vendors right now, that it'd be nice if they'd be able to get a radio that would cover CBRS and maybe some of the mid-band, mid-C-band, and maybe even some of the stuff that's coming out auction 110, and into one radio, and that, which would save us on capital costs. Of course, they'd rather sell us 3 radios because they can make a lot more money doing that. But if there's anything that can be done to help get some economies of scale and better use of some of the equipment where we can combine things, so it makes it easier for all of us, that'd be great.
So we're talking about coexistence here. If you're in PALs, you're in the low part of the band, you're going to have a very high-powered, if the auction clears, and I think that's a question. We've got to raise at least 50% of what the C-band auction did, with the assumption that those pockets were both deep and empty. If it clears the 50%, the PAL is going to have a very high power neighbor down below. So whether you're a secondary leaser like Carlos or you own the PAL, does that mean we need to be doing more about coexistence with those bands? Because you're going to be seeing 500 times sounds more than dB. So 500 times roughly more power next to channel 1. I don't know what channels you have, but is this a concern for you guys? Is there something more we need to be doing here? Right.
Anything that can be done for the coexistence would be great. I mean, I know there's challenges, but the software that's been developed to handle a lot of those challenges just keeps evolving. So, if anything that can help in that regard would be great.
Carlos, is there something we need to be doing? Are you guys thinking at all about the impact of the 345, 355 auction?
So, a decision this week also was made. We're walking away from it. So,
With the reserve price,
Yeah, it's
It'd be about 10 times more expensive than PALs went.
yeah. So the cost is a heavy ticket. So right now I just refocus all the strategy based on what we have in GAA, secondary market, and develop to enhance new band and technology that we can have access, get it approved for TDD, and implementing the rules of engagements of Y6 and use it for enhance the current deployments in rural America.
So you mentioned 150 megahertz. Is that a significant? Does that sort of that really increases your appetite for adjacent PAL?
Yes.
It's we sort of thought of PALs as 710s. If the metric the FCC put in front of you is 150 megahertz, then 10 here and there is not helping you much.
Exactly. We need, moving to the future, at least the minimum is 40 megahertz and then move up from there. It's 20 megahertz, and what you can do is do 45.3 to provide as a service as we do today. But to get into these 100 levels, you got to go north, the downlink of that.
Ray, I saw you nodding on that one. Is that the new base? That's the new 10 megahertz is 40?
Yeah. I mean, everybody is continually pushing for faster speeds up and down, and it's going that way. You have to in order to compete.
So that means there's one PAL and then maybe one lightweight PAL per county. The way you guys view it, that makes a lot more competition in the secondary market, and the secondary market, rather than disaggregating, is actually becoming aggregation in order to put together that much packaging of spectrum, which was not something our last two speakers spoke about. They sort of talked as if each PAL was an independent sort of orthogonal thing. And both of you guys are saying one PAL is relatively useless to you.
Yeah,
I don't want to put words in your mouth.
Well, the nice thing is that we've got the 600 megahertz to anchor it to, so we've got a little kick there too. So, and like I said, we did at least a minimum of 2 PALs in each license area and up to 4. So we hopefully have enough.
Okay. Josh, do we have any questions come in? So, well, Josh is copying things over. We got a couple. We have a little bit of time left. What haven't we talked about? What's important about the decision about PALs, or for most of our members, it'll be a decision about either to lease into the secondary market or to lease from it. You guys have both been looking at this problem more than most of our members. What are the insights you've gained in going through this process? Ray, let's let you start.
Well, again, we're happy with our decision. We've not seen anything that would make us want to reverse what we've done. It's a continual learning curve on all this, and so we're very, I guess, our expectations that we believe will be met and what we're going to be able to do, and we'll be able to provide what we want to our customers.
Carlos, you guys are probably going through the same thinking a lot of our members are. Like, this whole secondary market thing sounds cool. Want to go into it? How are you approaching analyzing it?
Yeah, so on some areas, we're not on the entire county. So if there is a PAL owner that has the entire county, he's only deployed in this area, and we'll approach. We're in Michigan. Ray has an area that he's not deployed, and I have towers in Michigan. I will probably approach him and let's work this out. But the entire process has to be set in stone, the leasing process and vetted and all that. That's how it's going to be. I approached several WISP operators that has PAL licenses, and I have good relationship with the majority of my neighbors. You have to. Can be, it's as big as we are in wireline and how we're growing. Everybody sees how Frontier is doing on the deploying fiber. I'm doing a lot of stuff on millimeter wave. I'm doing a lot of stuff for Gigabit America, but my prime priority right now is where do I have all of my bucket? And my bucket is replace copper plants with wireless. And to do that, I have to, look into spectrum availability, what I have in place, and the secondary market will bring me, I can segment, okay, I just need this amount here, this amount here, this amount here. This is going to take me this such amount of time to fill up, because it's like Ray said, the demand of rural America, you provide 45.3, and then all of a sudden they want 100. All of a sudden they want this.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give you some sample, we deploy market in the middle of nowhere in Iowa. And the same day we deploy, I went there with the guys and all that. We did, even went into a radio station and announced this, and went to a house that there were about 8 people living in the house, entire family. All of a sudden, next day they went and got 4K TVs and all that. They start streaming, and I asked one of my guys, "Can you analyze that traffic?" They start steady traffic from 6 p.m. to 11 p.m. of 9.5 meg. Everybody streaming from different channels. It's just like
Google appreciates that because we now charge $20K a month extra when people get the 4K. That's 5 TVs running 4K.
It is like that. And then when you plan networks, fixed wireless networks, we plan a steady traffic BC hour, 6 megs. That's our methodology. But when somebody in the middle of a cornfield is generating 9 megs, and then on rural America thinks the only marketing is you got internet, they're going to tell their neighbor, all of a sudden you got all these orders, and all of a sudden you got a thinking capacity on the tower. Oh, I got to increase my capacity. I got to move from a small cell to a macro, from a macro to 44R to a 6014. Oh, I got to go into multi-band antenna. It's just constantly moving the chains, never stops. So rural America is becoming challenging. And now we're doing implementation by design instead of design to look. It's just going into doing like a door-to-door kind of a Q&A to citizens, and then we can plan what we're going to do in this area, because we fill up some networks. Bringing 10 gig to a tower in the middle of nowhere costs money, and now those 10 gig, we're increasing it 100 gig on a tower. So it's pressure, but I like it and I love it. It's a rush of adrenaline when that happens, because that means that we're making a difference in the country.
You wireless and wired providers got America through COVID. I mean, if people couldn't have done what they did, it's the internet industry that made this lockdown possible. So congratulations to all of you. I really thank you guys for coming on and discussing what Carlos, in your case, sort of a in your face, a somewhat painful decision. I hadn't really expected that. That wasn't how I thought this would go. But I appreciate the frankness. Right, good to see you on, and good luck to you guys. Before we break this panel off, I want to remind everyone that we should have the opportunity for many more conversations like this in the halls, in person, at our next full member meeting in St. Louis. So we've tried to put a lot more of the conversational into the program, because that's what everyone said they missed in the events. But we're going to do it for real, hopefully in 3 months. So if this is the kind of thing you want us to do, you will have 3 days of it available, and we'll have announcements. But we're going to really try to provide more of this kind of interaction for people, in addition to the standard formal program. So thanks, everyone. We have a break, and then we